Hello, I am Yoder of Coriander Quilts, and I am here to talk about my top 10 Coriander Quilts patterns. I've been a pattern designer for a number of years, and I've been a fabric designer for a number of years. And every time I release a fabric line, I release a new set of patterns so that you have patterns that perfectly work with that fabric line to show off your skills to all your friends, and so you have something new and fun each time you're working with the new fabric. So I'm going to share some of my favorites and talk a little bit about why they're my favorites. We're going to start with number 10 and work our way down to number 1. So first up is Ninth and Vine. Ninth and Vine was a pattern that I designed to work with my Pepper and Flax fabric line, and it has smaller piecing. I named it Ninth and Vine because it uses 9 patches, and the way that the quilt is laid out, it goes kind of in a vine sort of way. So Ninth and Vine. The next one that I enjoy is called Apple Creek, and I actually live not too far from Apple Creek, and so when I was working on this pattern, I wanted to come up with something that used apples, and so when I did, I thought I needed to name it after that little town that is close to me. So we have Apple Creek. The fun thing about this pattern is that if you use the right colors, you can easily turn your apples into pumpkins, and it makes an adorable fall quilt. So you can have Apple Creek or you could have Pumpkin Creek, depending on whichever one you wanted. My number 8 pattern is BACKROADS. BACKROADS is a jelly roll quilt, and this one is fun. You start with 2 jelly rolls, which might seem like a lot for a quilt, but at the end you actually have enough leftovers from when you've pieced your original BACKROADS quilt to make a whole second quilt top without buying any additional background fabric or additional print fabric. So you have enough to complete 2 quilt tops with the supplies that you've purchased for just your one. So it's a 2-for-1 quilt pattern. That's BACKROADS. Up next, we have Barnstar, and I have designed a series of Barnstar patterns, 4 of them, that can all work together. So I kind of like all of them, but I'm lumping them all together as a favorite. So Barnstars 1 through 4, they are 40-inch blocks, and you just need 1 large block to complete your quilt top. So if you take all 4 Barnstars and put them together, you end up with an 80-inch square quilt, which is really just 4 quilt blocks, and you have a nice sized quilt. So I think that one is a lot of fun. The next favorite that I have is Line Dried. I like Line Dried. It's made up of a whole bunch of Ohio stars. And I know after I pieced this one, I sat down and counted how many Ohio stars I had just made, and I think it's 106. Now don't quote me on that, but you can count them up after you make them yourself. It's a lot of Ohio stars, but the end result is so pretty, and it's really one of my favorite quilts. And I'm always kind of partial to an Ohio star because I'm an Ohio girl, so Ohio stars are super fitting. And while we're talking about Ohio stars, the next quilt that I really like of the quilt patterns that I've designed is called Plain and Fancy. And it is a Dresden quilt pattern. I always love a Dresden, and I think a lot of people are sometimes intimidated by making a Dresden quilt, but they're not tricky at all. Just take your time. But the thing that sets my Plain and Fancy quilt apart a little bit is that it has a pieced Ohio star in the center of each Dresden quilt block. So you're making the Dresden, but then you're adding a little pizzazz to the center with those Ohio stars. And I wanted to share a little bit about the name of this pattern. I have a thing for words, and I like when it kind of fits in a little bit. So Plain and Fancy came from where I grew up and where I live now. I live in a little Amish community, and we have these little stores around us that are called Plain and Fancy stores, and it's because the plain part is for the Amish people and the fancy part is for the English people. So it's little stores that carry a bunch of different things, kind of a little variety store, and they call them Plain and Fancies. And so this quilt kind of reminded me of that because it has, I guess Dresdens aren't really plain, but it has that little plain part and then the little fancy part in the center. So that is Plain and Fancy. The next quilt that I really like is Tulip Market. Tulip Market is a jelly roll quilt, and I do like a flower on a quilt. Any kind of flowers on a quilt I always think are so pretty. You'll notice I use a lot of flowers in my fabrics, and so I will use them in my quilts too. So this is just a jelly roll quilt, and it comes together quickly, and it's another one of those ones that looks like you spend a lot of work, but the techniques are simple and it comes together quickly. And it's one that I know a lot of people really enjoy. So we are down to our top 3 quilts, my top 3 quilts. The third from the top is Beholden 2, and that's the one that you see here in front of me. The reason I love this one is because it looks like a grandmother's flower garden quilt. I love quilts that are traditional but have a spin. So the spin on this one is that it's all just piecing techniques that you would be familiar with. There's no handwork, no paper piecing, no templates. It's all regular piecing. And so I really enjoy that traditional look, but with an easy to piece technique. So that's Beholden 2. Number 2 on my list is my Dashing quilt. Dashing was actually the very first pattern I designed under my pattern line, Coriander Quilts. And it is a churn dash, as you can see, and star, so 2 super traditional blocks, but I have added a little bit of pizzazz to them, and they create a really neat secondary pattern that you see when you see the whole quilt, and I really like that. Again, it's just another fun spin on some traditional quilt blocks. And my number 1 pattern that I love is my Maple Charm quilt. And I'm gonna share a little bit more about the story of this quilt. When I very first started making quilts, I was over in Pennsylvania, in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, which is another little Amish community, and I was with my husband. We were newly married, and looking back, I'm so surprised that my husband got dragged into all of these quilt shops with me, like in his early 20s, a guy going into quilt shops, newly married, but he was happy to do it. And the thing was, I wasn't making quilts yet. I was just buying fabric. So he's taking his wife into the fabric stores, happily, I might add, and we were buying the fabric. And when I was in a quilt shop over there, I saw a maple leaf quilt, and I decided I wanted to make this maple leaf quilt. So I asked if they had the pattern. They didn't have a pattern for this quilt. And I had never sewn before, so I was just buying the fabric but not sewing. And so I went home, determined that I was going to figure out how to make this maple leaf quilt. Now, I have quilters in my family, so I certainly had people that I could ask. I found a book that had the maple leaf pattern that I was interested in the book, and I bought the book, and it was a template-based quilt. So I made my little cardboard template patterns, and I picked out fabrics that I thought were just wonderful at a local quilt shop where I live, and I cut out all of my pieces, and then I sent everything that I had just cut out over to my mom, and I asked her if she would sew it together for me, and she did. And so I kind of jokingly call that my first quilt. I always tell people I'm not sure that really counts because I didn't actually do anything with the quilt. But it was a maple leaf quilt. And so that kind of springboarded me onto starting to sew the things together myself, not sending everything over to my mom to sew together. And that started my quilting journey. And so once I had a few fabric lines out and I was thinking about patterns that I wanted to design, I knew that I wanted to do a maple leaf quilt, but I wanted to do one that didn't require any specialty templates or anything like that. That would be simple to piece, and I love a scrappy quilt, so I wanted something super scrappy. So that's how I came up with my Maple Charm quilt, and I just feel like that just brings it full circle back to where I started. So that's definitely one of the quilt patterns that has a special place in my heart. So those are my top 10. Thanks so much for following along. If you see any patterns that you'd like to purchase, Fat Quarter Shop carries both the paper versions and the PDF patterns of all of the patterns you've just seen, and I'd love to see your creations using them.